All right, let's pick back up where we left off with the Gilded Age. So, as I told you before, this entire time period is actually known as the Gilded Age. If you take a college class, it's going to be called the Gilded Age. But we're focusing more so on society during this time, because if something is gilded, it's essentially just covered with gold on the outside and made of something cheaper on the inside. So it appears to be really rich and really nice, but on the inside, it's just regular, everyday kind of, junk. So we call this the Gilded Age because it applies to this period from 1870 to 1900, where we have America being, or the United States technically, being the richest country in the world, but only the top 1% actually holding all of the wealth. So we're kind of focusing on the disparities between wealth with the rich and the poor. And we're also looking at a lot of the culture in this section. So this is one of my favorite sections. It's a big section too. So we'll probably split it from the rest of the chapter. So one of the main ideas during this time period is called individualism, and basically the idea of individualism is just that it doesn't matter what your circumstances are, what you're born into, whether or not you're successful depends on you. So your success is going to go as far as you allow it to, or the how successful you are depends on you, and you can only go as far as you allow yourself. So we talk about a lot of rags to riches stories whenever we focus on this. It's a good way of kind of looking at it, people who that's kind of the proof behind it. The proof is in the pudding kind of thing. Obviously you have some people who have made it from rags to riches, but just because some people do doesn't mean that everybody can make it that way. People who are individualists or self-reliant and don't need help, or don't think that you need help to be successful. So as far as government handouts and things like that, that would be a negative for these people. Another idea that comes to pass during this time is social Darwinism. So if you recall from world history, Darwin, or Charles Darwin, has this whole theory of evolution and natural selection. And this guy named Herbert Spencer basically just applies his theories of evolution and natural selection to human society. He says that human society evolves through competition and natural selection, and that society progresses and becomes better only because the fittest people survive. So the reason that we've gotten so industrialized and the reason that we've been so successful is because all the other people who didn't necessarily want to try as hard have kind of fallen off the map, and so or they've died out. So to them, it's if people are struggling, we should just let them struggle, because all they're going to do is bring us down, is a better nation. And so survival of the fittest becomes the catchphrase for this philosophy. So for a lot of Christians, Darwinism obviously is upsetting and offensive. We don't necessarily want to see a whole lot of people just getting forgotten about or not taken care of because they don't have the means to. So they reject the theory of evolution because it contradicts the Bible's account of creation anyway. And we have these debates that come about between the creationism and the Darwinism. It's still debated today. It's going to be debated until we die. And then you have some people who are Christian evolutionists who basically say that maybe Darwin's right and evolution is a thing and God allowed it to happen. Maybe that was God's way of creating the world. So there's a lot of arguments over Darwin's the whole theory of evolution as well. So Carnegie, if you recall from the last section, industrialization, he actually advocates for a gentler version of social Darwinism, and he calls it the gospel of wealth. He basically says yes, people are some people are less fortunate, but what we should do is try to help society and give them means to help themselves. So instead of giving direct handouts, because Carnegie is one of the richest men in the world at this point in time, he's I'm going to build some schools and some churches and hospitals and maybe some libraries and things like that. And that way, people who are less fortunate or people who are poor and can't afford these things can use them. It can be just for the public. So he becomes known for like his philanthropy projects, and he donates over $350 million total in his lifetime, which is like billions of dollars in today's money. So another idea during this time is realism. So a lot of people, especially like your authors and your artists during the time, want to portray the world realistically. They kind of want everybody to know what's really going on, and like they want to create art and work that is relatable. And so you get the addition of artists like some of the European artists are Edgar Degas and Edward Monet, and then you have um, an American painter who's known as like one of the most well-known American realist painters, Thomas Eakins, and he would just paint people like rowing, people playing baseball, surgeons and scientists in action, like different things like that that you could probably like take a picture of, but we don't have like picture cameras everywhere, so he paints them instead. And then you have some painters like authors like Mark Twain, who write books like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and it's supposed to be kind of like a relatable story during like Jim Crow laws and different things like that. But like I don't know how realistic it is to talk about a young boy traveling down the Mississippi River on a raft with some random African American who's trying to make it to freedom. So I don't know. Realistic, but not maybe. Yeah. Saloons are also a major part of pop culture. People, of course, like the standard of living has gone up. People have more money to spend on like entertainment and recreation. And so in the cities, a lot of men, whenever they get off work, instead of going straight home, they're like, I'm going to stop in at the bar and get me a drink. And they would have like water for their horses. They'd have free toilets, free newspapers, and peanuts and salty food at the bar as snacks to make people more thirsty and make people want to buy more drinks. Your saloon keepers are key figures in political machines during this time as well. Also, it's important to note that this is whenever we start to see a spike in domestic abuse, and we'll talk more about that in the next couple chapters as well, like whenever we start addressing these problems and prohibition. So amusement parks and sports are like huge during this time also. Like I said, working class families have some time off here and there, and they have extra money to spend. So they go to places like New York's Coney Island. They watch professional sports. The first professional baseball team formed in 1869, and it was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, or Red Sox that we know today. In 1903, the first World Series was played between the Boston Red Sox and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Football also becomes popular. It starts in colleges and then kind of spreads from there to like high schools and like other areas around. Tennis, golf, and croquet are popular for exercise and like fun. And then in 1891, James Naismith, who is like an athletic director for a college in Massachusetts, invented basketball. And so that becomes a really popular sport as well. Another pastime, or a couple pastimes, vaudeville and ragtime. So ragtime is just like kind of a genre of music, right? It's just like syncopated rhythms, things that you'd hear in honky tonks that pianists would play, banjo players, different things like that. And it's like based off of like the different like patterns in African American music. So one of the most famous African American ragtime composers is Scott Joplin. He's known as the king of ragtime, and he's known for the Maple Leaf Rag, which I linked for you for your listening pleasure. Vaudeville, on the other hand, I would think of it as just like a circus, a different name for a circus. They have animal acts, acrobats, dancers, things like that. I mean, the poster here, this is a vaudeville show. It even looks like a circus. So, very similar. But it's a fun place to go, to take the family, to get out and just get some entertainment, try things out, new culture, new things. So, as far as politics go, because we do have to hit on politics very briefly, James Garfield is elected president in 1980, and a lot of his supporters, like people who had voted for him, wanted the spoils of office, aka, I supported you, I campaigned for you, I want a job in the government. And so Garfield didn't believe in the system, and so even though people supported him and like helped him get votes, he wasn't going to just hand them jobs unless they actually had skills to do the jobs. And so basically, one of these guys kept coming to the White House every day in the spring of 1881 looking for a job. And he gets rejected every time because Garfield's like, sorry, like, if I find something, I'll let you know. But for now, we're just going to kind of like, chill. So basically, this guy, he must have been like out of his mind because he's like, honestly, I might have a better chance to get a job if Chester Arthur is president instead. So he shoots President Garfield in hopes that whenever Chester Arthur becomes president, that he'll get a job from him. Obviously, this guy's arrested, like he doesn't get a job, and then Garfield dies from his wounds. So he's assassinated, one of our 4 assassinated presidents. So Garfield's assassination is noteworthy. Like we obviously like it's highlighted because like we need to understand, and like we did understand at this point in time, the need to reform the political system, because a lot of people were getting jobs through the spoil system where it's just like, oh, we're friends, I'm going to hire him, or we're friends, I'll hire her. You can't just reward people jobs. Some people need to work in the government who are qualified to work in the government to make the government more efficient and less corrupt. So Congress passes the Pendleton Act that requires some jobs to be filled by competitive written exams. So this act marks the beginning of the professional civil service, where a lot of government workers start getting jobs based on their qualifications rather than their political affiliation. So the election of 1894 is when Grover Cleveland is the first Democratic president elected since 1856, like before the Civil War. And like we call him an honest Democrat. He's known as someone who was not necessarily crooked or worried about the he's worried about the South, of course, but he's not, stopping people from voting and like African Americans, or prohibiting things from happening. He's kind of just a regular Joe. So Cleveland faced supporters who expected him to reward them with jobs, and then he faced people who expected him to increase the number of jobs protected by the civil service system. So instead of saying, I'm going to hand out jobs to my friends, or I'm going to hand out jobs based on qualifications, he just kind of stands in the middle and doesn't really make a big deal out of it. And he's just like, whatever, whoever gets the job gets it. And a lot of people got mad. Like he basically makes everybody mad. So he got lucky though, because economic issues replaced that debate about the patronage system anyway. And so he got to focus more on econ rather than how people got jobs in the government. So during this time, we also have the creation of the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. Basically, a lot of businesses and farmers were having to pay really high rates to ship their goods. And so state laws tried to pass laws regulating the rates of railroads. And unfortunately, in 1886, the Supreme Court said that that was not constitutional because the federal government was the only entity that could regulate interstate commerce. One state can't, make things up. Anyway, if it's interstate, it's got to be the federal government making it up. So public pressure forced Congress to respond. And so Cleveland signs the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. So he's hoping that this is going to set railroad rates all across the country and make things reasonable and just for everyone. No more high rates for small businesses and farmers. Everybody gets the same rate, basically. Unfortunately, this commission is not effective because it had to rely on the courts to enforce the rulings. And whenever, these small businesses or farmers would take these rail companies to court, the courts would just be like, sorry. Oh, well. So another major economic issue concerned tariffs. So a lot of Democrats thought that Congress should cut tariffs to raise the price of manufactured goods. And a lot of them questioned the need to maintain high tariffs in the 1880s because a lot of American companies at this point in time are able to compete competitively, internationally. It's we're producing goods at a pretty fast rate. I think we can handle a little competition. But Grover Cleveland tries. He pushes to lower tariffs because he's a Democrat, and his subjects, most of his subjects are in the South, where farming is kind of a major industry, and your farmers are the ones who are wanting to ship their products out for lower tariffs so that they can make money, because that's where a lot of their money is made. So the House did pass some reductions, but the Republican-controlled Senate would reject the bill every time the House would try to do something. So tariff reduction became a major issue in the next election of 1888. And this is where Republicans come back with Benjamin Harrison. So he loses the popular vote, but he wins the electoral vote, which is helpful for him. And then the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress as well as the White House after this election. So one of the downsides is we get a lot of budget deficits during this time, and it's not because the Republicans are just not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's just that they're advocating for money to be spent in other places, but we're not making more money to put in other places to budget. And so as a result, we get the McKinley tariff, which it lowers federal revenue and causes a budget deficit, where they try to lower tariffs for tobacco taxes and tariff rates on raw sugar, but it increases them on other goods like textiles. So people stop buying those imports, and it kind of hurts the debt, makes a deficit. So Congress then passes a new pension law, and it's so that they can give payments to veterans and increase the number of veterans that receive payments, because you want to honor your veterans, you want to take care of them. They've fought or risked their lives for your country, and so on and so forth. And so it's a good plan. It just, we didn't have the money for it. So it increases the deficit. The country goes into more debt. Congress also tries to break up trust during this time with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is kind of a joke. It's poorly enforced, vaguely worded, and it's weakened even more by judicial interpretation. So the Supreme Court basically says that it doesn't apply to manufacturing, and it has to be interstate commerce. And so the law didn't really have very much impact. So even though it wasn't effective, it still set the precedent for future laws to be established to break up trust and promote competition in the economy. So back to social Darwinism. So a lot of people by 1879, in 1870 is whenever this whole idea of social Darwinism begins. 1879, this guy, Henry George, basically says, there's a huge gap between your working class and your upper class, your people who own the companies and the businesses, and the people who are working in them. And because there's such a wide disparity between the rich and the poor, laissez-faire economics, aka the government letting things be, isn't working. It's making society worse. And social Darwinism basically said that if you continue to use the laissez-faire economics and keep the government out of everything and kind of just let people fail, let the people who are failing fail, everything would eventually work out. That's not really the case here. It's no, that's not going to work. So some economists tried to argue with George's analysis, because they were even though you're saying that there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, the standard of living has still gone up. People are still living better than they would have been. And he's that's true. However, people are still living in terrible working conditions. People are still poor. There's still a lot of crime. We still have a lot of problems in the cities. And so his economic theories really encourage other reformers to challenge the assumptions of the era as well. So Lester Frank Ward writes this book called Dynamic Sociology, and he argues that humans are different from animals, and therefore you can't really apply regular Darwinism, the social Darwinism. So his idea is referring to reform Darwinism, because basically people can make plans to change their future outcomes, where animals don't really have that. Animals don't make plans. They don't have planners. So people can make their lives better if they want to. People had succeeded because of their ability to cooperate. As long as you cooperate and you just kind of buy in, everything's going to be fine. Competition is wasteful. It's time consuming. Let the government regulate the economy. Let them cure poverty. Let them promote education, because the marketplace isn't really doing a good job of it. So basically he's advocating for more hands on from the government. So then Edward Bellamy writes his book, and this book is kind of cool. It's 1888. He publishes Looking Backward. And it's about a guy who falls asleep in 1887 and wakes up in the year 2000 to realize that everything is perfect. There's no crime, there's no poverty, there's no politics. Funny. The government owned all the industry and shared wealth equally with all Americans. It's basically a form of socialism. And so, like, a lot of people buy his book. It's a bestseller, and it really shapes the thinking of some of his reformers. In literature, we have naturalism as well. So, like, this is where people start to criticize the industrial society in literature. Basically, we're not going to go out and like make speeches about it. We're going to write books about it. So, some of the books that people said, like naturalists called basically social Darwinists, they were like, y'all don't understand. Like, some people fail simply because they're in circumstances that are out of their control. Some people like really can't help it, no matter what they do. Like, they constantly get knocked down throughout life. So Stephen Crane writes a book called Maggie, A Girl of the Streets in 1893, and it basically talks about a girl's descent into prostitution and then death. Jack London talks about Alaskan wilderness and the power of nature over civilization. And then you get Theodore Dreiser, who writes about people sinning without punishment and where the pursuit of wealth and power would like destroy people's character. So basically, it's not good to pursue wealth and power. It's better to like just be it's better to just like do the best that you can and just kind of like live your life. So a lot of different thoughts coming about during this time. So the social gospel is a movement working for like to better conditions in cities according to like biblical ideas of charity and justice. So the church is supposed to demand protection for the moral safety of people, and the church gospel movement inspired a lot of churches to take on new community functions. So basically, a lot of churches start building gyms. They provide social programs so that they can watch kids in the neighborhoods, and they focus on like helping the poor. A couple other programs that come are the Salvation Army and the YMCA. Around Christmas time at Walmart, you get the people outside like dressed up in their Christmas best and like their Santa suits, and they ring the bells asking for donations. It's the Salvation Army usually. So the Salvation Army basically offers aid and religious counseling to the urban poor, and then the YMCA helps out industrial workers and the urban poor by organizing Bible studies and like citizenship training and group activities for like immigrants to participate in. They also have libraries and gyms and auditoriums and low-cost hotel rooms available on a temporary basis for those in need as well. So the settlement house movement also begins as an offshoot of the social gospel movement. In the late 1800s, idealistic reformers established these houses in like really heavily immigrant neighborhoods. And so the settlement house is a community center where like people would go for medical care, English classes, kindergarten classes, and like even just like recreational programs. And it was meant to just like help assimilate those immigrants into city life, and so they could be more successful in America. Jane Addams opened the famous Hull House in Chicago in 1889, and her work actually inspires other people like Lillian Wald to found the Henry Street Settlement in New York City. And you start to see the settlement houses just pop up all across the country as a result, especially like immigrant heavy cities. So industrialization and urbanization leads to the need for more workers who are trained and educated. So public schools, of course, increase dramatically. And a lot of them are teaching like immigrant children English and like American history and culture. And this whole idea is called Americanization. Skills that you learn in school are like discipline and strong work ethic. You get grammar schools dividing students and teaching them punctuality and neatness and efficiency. And basically, like your public education is meant to like train people up to be productive members of the workforce. So high schools would teach like vocational skills for specific trades and different things that they might need to know if they work in factories. Education is like super valuable in urban areas, and like African Americans even start their own schools following the example of Booker T. Washington. So I'll stop here, and I will pick back up with populism, and we'll look a little bit at some disparities between race as well.